Okay, cool. So it looks like we're live now on Facebook, YouTube. I'll let Deb and Adrian in. Got some good folks with us today. Hey everyone, welcome. Welcome Deb. Welcome Adrian. Good to have you guys here today. I'm going to mute you for the time being, Deb. You can unmute yourself when necessary because I'm hearing like a little background noise. Yeah, that got rid of it. Cool. All right, awesome. So I will give a little bit of a introduction to the session here today. Basically, last week we had on Cortland Allen of the Indie Hackers podcast, and that was an interesting session. He's grown his podcast within a few years to 160 up to 160 downloads in an episode, and he kind of gave us a bit of his story from the start and to where he got to where he is now. And basically what we're going to do today is do a little bit of a follow-up and get into it a little bit more deeply. Some of the key aspects that he brought up that he thought were important to his podcast growth. The main ones that stuck out to me were quality and consistency. And then we went deeper into quality. He talked about, different ways that he researches the podcast, different ways that he took his propensities and his interests and incorporated them in really focusing in on this one thing, which included the podcast, but he also has a community website. And so he put a lot of his time, energy, and talent from multiple directions into developing it. And also some tips on kind of how to engage better with the guests, how to bring topics into the podcast that actually make people want to return so that they can stay engaged and enjoy what's going on. And specifically talked about just like having a good conversation and having that conversation he used the topic insights per minute. So having it be something where, an insight is on the edge of every moment, or as often as you can get it, where the listener's going, oh, that's intriguing, that's unique, let me check that out, or that was something that I hadn't heard of before. And and then on top of that, there's a topic that I think I'll probably just sort of jump into because I think it's an interesting one to share. And that's just kind of engaging in the conversation. He said he definitely likes to prepare for his interviews. But even though he is prepared, he's really found that the conversation goes much, much better when he's kind of playing it in the moment and he's really engaged. He's paying attention to what they're saying and asking the follow-up questions that both he and his listeners would really be interested to hear. And so, he kind of gave that idea that engagement level is really powerful to make it a good interview. And it's also great for the listener. So one thing I'm going to bring right now, I just want to share with you folks, is an exercise in communication. And I'll put some text up on the screen just so that you can follow along as I read through it. And we can decide whether we want to try the exercise. It's something that you can try on your own. We can decide whether we feel that that's a good use of our time in the moment here. But in the beginning here, I think that I'd like to just kind of share the structure of it and walk you through it. And there's actually some other exercises that you can access through a similar resource that I found this one. But yeah, so we'll dive into it, and I'll put this text up on the screen and so you can follow along. So actually, you know what? Let me just share this one little screen. Okay. Yeah, so can you all see this text, and is it large enough for you to see?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So this is something that I've gotten from this movement. It feels new to me. I encountered it maybe around 2017. It's probably been around slightly or even more longer than that, but I found it quite interesting. Went to a few groups that were engaged with this style of exercises and communication when I was living in New York, and met some interesting people who have also been a part of trying this kind of stuff out. And I will say that there's a couple different ways that I've heard it referred to, and I think it's just because it might be new and different people are taking their own paths. One thing is called authentic relating, and so the idea is kind of training and learning how you can relate in the moment with others, be it in a conversation, just, at the dinner table, with a friend, or, in an interview like we're talking about. And another thing is circling, which is sort of a related concept where you kind of get together with a group of people and you do these communication exercises. It's kind of hard to describe unless you do it in the moment, but I liken it almost to a sort of, if you were to turn conversation into almost like a meditative practice, so that you're very present, you're very in the moment, and you're not really thinking about the past or the future too much. You're really focused on whatever is going on in the moment. So this particular exercise I'm going to share with you was put together by a couple of folks named Brian Bayer and Decker Kunov, who kind of started this whole thing. And I'll just read through the setup and walk through it, make any comments, and then we can either discuss it or try it or move on. But I really want to present this to you, and I'll give you guys this in a download as well once this is over. So the game is deceptively simple. If you play it right, it will take you far off the path of shallow conversation and into discovering a deep territory you never knew lay beneath the surface. So it's actually very basic. You have two people, they will stand or sit directly across from each other and make eye contact, which is something that we don't always do when we're having conversations. So that alone can be an interesting exercise in presence and engagement. So we'll call the two people person A and person B, and very simple rules. One person says, "What I'm noticing with you now is," and you can notice various things, which I'll go into a moment. And the other person just responds and they say, "Hearing that, I'm noticing." And you go back and forth. You just keep doing that. And as the people who created this game, you keep doing that until you're incapacitated with laughter, epiphany, tears, etc. So it actually it's deceptively simple, but puts you in this mode where you kind of get to access some deep emotions and some deep connection. And you also, like I've found, you learn a lot more. You learn a lot more about that other person and maybe even about yourself. So you can also set a timer for the game, 45 seconds, 5 minutes, whatever you want. And then a little bit more detail about things that you may want to share when you share this. Observations, thoughts, sensations, and feelings. You could share anything you're noticing inside the structure of A and B going back and forth. And usually, just so you know, it's like each person doesn't talk for that long. Maybe a few sentences usually is enough to kind of initiate the other person talking. Some examples of if you were to share about the other person's physical appearance. "I'm noticing the smoothness of your skin, the way your glasses frame your eyes, that you seem to be looking away a lot, the speckles of gray in your beard." And, a couple of things I'll point out about these examples. One is, you may notice that if you've had romantic moments with someone, that you were in a similar state that you might get into when you're in this state. You're sort of like, you might say something like, "I'm noticing your eyes," right? Same way that you might have noticed that when you're with someone on a date or something like that. But you also might notice something coming up in your head that you might not quite want to say. So like, it's a good example of the speckles of gray in your beard. So it's really good to try to shut off the filter a little bit. And if something does come into your head, if you're new to it, it's okay to like go to the next thing if it doesn't feel quite right. But say the thing, say what you're actually noticing. Don't lie, don't make up something to make someone feel better if you think they're going to be offended because you noticed the gray in their beard. Sensations in your own body is something else that you can notice. So it doesn't have to be external. You can say, "I'm feeling nervous, tension in my chest. I felt my shoulders relax when you smiled. Our eye contact is making me feel uncomfortable." And just to give a little bit more context about why you might share your sort of feelings as well as things that are going on externally. So kind of you want to think about the present moment as a map that includes your external world and your internal world. And this actually helps sometimes. It's helped me, I would say, understand things that are going on me that I might not going on within me that I might not have actually noticed. Right. So if I think about and I verbalize it, I'll say, oh, I'm feeling nervous. Oh, I'm feeling envious or something like that. Right. Those things are important to start noticing, and you can even bring them up in conversations. Some people, just an example of that envious piece. If you're in a conversation with someone, sometimes people don't know how to respond when they're feeling envious of someone. They get uncomfortable. They maybe get angry. Maybe they just do weird stuff. And one interesting thing to do if you are feeling envious, you could even have that with a podcast guest. They're talking about all their amazing successes, and you say, I'm noticing I'm feeling really envious of you right now. And just going ahead and saying it and putting it out there, if that's strong for you, it can really lead to a relief of your internal feelings and, more engaging conversation. You can also refer to thoughts you're having. So the feelings are different than the thoughts. Feelings will be more connected with like actual feelings in your body. Thoughts are more that intellectual side. I'm thinking about some work I need to do. I'm becoming curious about your shirt, how long you've had it. I want to reassure you that I'm not offended by your comment, right? So again, like going back to those uncomfortable moments, if your thoughts follow them, then that's okay. And then let's see here. Oh, this is sensations in your body. I'm conflating these two, and there's kind of a reason for that. But so we talked about sensations in your body, and the next is emotions that you're feeling. Reason I conflate these two things is the more you play a game like this, the more you notice that how connected your feelings are that you would state. Like, I feel excited. How connected those actual feelings are to actual sensations in your body. So then you could say, what does it mean to feel excited? Oh, my heart is beating faster. My skin is getting a little bit cold. I'm breathing. I feel like my breath is short. These actual things that you can feel in your body. So emotions that you're feeling, you say, I'm scared that you're upset. I pointed out the gray in your beard. I'm grateful you complimented me. I needed that. I'm having fun playing this game. And just a couple tips towards the end. Before you play the game, it's useful to get grounded beforehand. Again, if you're not used to this, doing it this way, that's fine, but you could take a minute to close your eyes, each of the people beforehand, just to breathe and kind of center yourself. I went through this already a little bit, but take risks. Go ahead and say the first thing that comes to your mind, even if you might not normally do it, and stay in the moment. So definitely this goes along with, you may have prepared questions, you may have a thing that you think will work really well, but even if you had something that you were thinking of saying a minute ago, but right now in the moment, there's something else, say the thing that's in the moment as opposed to the thing that's in the past. And in general, whenever you find yourself thinking about the future or the past at all, you can talk about that's happening for you, but try not to go there, in your mind too much. Try to stay in the present moment. So that's a little bit of overview of this exercise. And I think afterwards, I just want to kind of get a little bit of feedback from you guys and see, what you think. Would you try this? It could be can sound like a little bit awkward. Anybody have any thoughts to share about this?
I wonder if the practice of it is good practice for you as a host of a podcast, right? I don't know that I would do this with your guest in your podcast, though. It might be principles that you're thinking about as you observe your guest. But if you're trying to apply this to a podcast, I would be cautious of getting too personal on your podcast, unless it depends on what your podcast is, I guess. But you could easily go over a line that people feel uncomfortable with to be public with, right?
Yeah, that's important. And I think I wanted to mention this. I don't know if I made it super clear. So most people, they just communicate, and
Right.
we've been practicing communication since we were born, but sometimes we don't intentionally communicate. Like, what is it like to practice my communication skills? And so this particular exercise is good if you want to sort of, it's almost like if you could step out of life and have a conversation that helps you work on your conversation skills in general. That's kind of how I think of this. Definitely don't jump into this with a guest without asking them. But do think about jumping into this with a friend or family member, and saying, hey, this is a little bit edgy or weird, but you want to try it. And you can do it with strangers too, especially in contexts where people are willing to kind of play around a little bit and have some fun. If you're out at an event or you're trying to get to know people that you don't know well, it can be an okay way to break the ice and get to know people. So thanks for sharing that, Rob. It's a very good point.
I would say, as if I'm understanding it, I don't know that I'm getting that it helps me so much with communication skills, except for the key component of communication, which is to actively listen, to really be present. It seems like that's more what it's helping you do, to be as present as possible. And that's such a challenge for us as podcasters. Cortland talked about this last week. He's filling his brain ahead of time with all of that research and study so that then he can free himself to have the conversation. But as he mentioned, as podcasters, we're managing time, we're managing flow, we're managing agenda, we're managing a topic. There's a lot going on at once. But I can see where this technique just in general would help with learning how to be present. I think the thing is, though, that would be interesting is if you really are going to be honest, how do you not offend somebody?
Well, yeah, and I think, and I know Deb had something to say, so I want to check in with her in a minute. Um, I wouldn't say that I've been experimenting with this directly on our podcast
Sure,
because,
yeah, no, I realize that.
because I didn't apply
You've
this.
used it in person kind of situations to see what you get out of the exercise is what I'm gathering. Yeah.
Yeah, but I will say, I just brought this exercise to the table because it's an interesting one and it applies. But I will say recently in our podcast with success, I've been willing to take a little bit more risk in the conversations with people. One of the things that's been coming up a bit, we're trying to find ways to make it better, ways to improve. So Chris and I are listening to our podcast episodes and we're saying, how could I make this better? How could I make this better? And we have a podcast producer as well. And various of us in different moments have said, it's kind of more enjoyable when you guys are laughing, a little bit and you're having some fun in the moment, how can you make that happen more? And you don't want to just like laugh, like, ha, 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 just force it out, But I've noticed as I keep that in mind that, hey, like it actually sounds good to the listener when there's more fun being happening. I'm trying things with the guests and I'm saying things that could get a little bit offensive, but in the name of, hey, we're trying to connect, we're trying to have a good time. We're not trying to, we're trying to be in the moment, and it's not all just a scripted thing. So with some success, I've been trying things like that, it's related to this. It's a little bit more about saying what's on your mind and offending people. It's a delicate game. Yeah, definitely. Right. And it depends on the podcast too. Like if you're Howard Stern, okay, maybe that's the game that you're playing.
That's what you expect too.
Exactly.
The other thing
I think it's all
that,
about setting expectations for your audience too, right? It depends on what the reputation that you have is too. I think it's a big part of this, right? Of creating your brand of what you represent on the show too. Because if the guest knows that they're going to get challenged on some things and maybe some things will get brought out a little bit more personal in there, that can create an interesting dynamic in the program too. But in some ways you have to kind of like set the expectations with the guest a little bit that there may be some personal stuff that I make a comment on to spark the conversation a little bit more, or maybe dig a little deeper into something. And I don't know, you're exactly right. It's a difficult balance to try and strike, but I do agree that it's a good goal to try and get more personal. with your interviews. I agree.
I was just going to add
that's
that,
great.
at least for me, I'm only doing audio, right? So
Right.
I know there's a big trend toward doing both. I just haven't been able to wrap my arms around doing both. So there aren't those visual cues, but I can still see where I can apply it in an adjusted way, right?
Right.
If I'm really listening to what you're telling me, and I could also apply it in a way of I'm hearing, what am I responding to, right? If it's not a visual cue, I'm talking about if I'm applying it in the process of interviewing somebody.
So you don't do like Zoom interviews, huh? You're doing.
I do, but I usually turn off the video for two reasons. One is just a bandwidth issue. You get better bandwidth that way. Secondly, and this is something I picked up along the way from various sources, if I'm depending on visual cues that are just between you and I, they might be useful in that I'm trying to get a word in, but the audience doesn't see those visual cues. And I don't want to impact the conversation to lean on those visual cues.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the other reason I don't do the video. Unless I'm going to publish the video content as well,
Right.
which I'm not there yet. I have enough to handle publishing an audio version. And, most of my listeners are consuming it just audio. So that's the reason why. It's why you see a lot of times, and even in radio, where people will be in two separate, so they don't see each other face to face, because we tend to rely on nods and other visual cues that I'm interpreting that the audience doesn't see.
Let me cut over here to Deb real quick.
Yeah,
She had a
Deb,
comment. I want to make sure she gets a chance to check in. How's it going, Deb?
Hi, hey, I'm doing great. So I appreciate you sharing that. It's for me about being more comfortable with taking risks. And I will tell you, one guest talks about stress management, and he took me through a breathing exercise. In 60 seconds on air, we did a breathing exercise. And when we were done, I actually couldn't remember my talking points or any of the questions. I was so in the moment, and then I started giggling, and then it took us a while to get on track. So what I'll say is we're very good at what we do, keeping on track, time management, managing the guests, and bringing maximum value. But taking a risk, laughing a little bit, and asking those edgy questions actually do start making you more relatable. Now, I'm still not comfortable with it, but when I see an opportunity, I'm starting to do it, and it makes for an interesting conversation. So definitely have to practice those that suggestion, Ethan. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure.
One thought just to add on to what Henry was talking about. I've been having more guests that even though Henry, I'm the same way where it's typically audio only for CX Chronicles podcast. However, I've had more guests lately who are like, hey man, why don't you just I know you're audio only, but let's just talk. And I'm like, so I've been doing it more to figure it out. And I've been thinking about expanding to video anyway, because we're all hearing that this is, a lot of people are having success with it, but it's definitely changes your game. Because what I've noticed, because I've gotten so good at listening, like hyper listening, that when I'm looking over here and I'm not like right on the microphone, focused on like audio and thinking about like what my next question is and thinking ahead, it's made for more listening back. It's made for more casual conversation. So I'm less focused on like the building blocks of in my head what a perfect episode is. And I'm literally just chatting with the person on the screen over here. And I'm kind of starting to like it, because in my last couple episodes, when I'm listening back, and I've even had a handful of people be like, hey, are you changing up your format? And I'm like, not really. I'm still trying to ping on the things that I've always pinged on. But apparently by me like focusing over here and looking at the person, it's changing something. And I don't know if it's better or worse, but like it's definitely
it's a great observation. It certainly is a lot of what Ethan's talking about, and that is obvious when you have conversations face to face. It seems like it's much more engaging. So it seems like people are feeling like they're listening in on a real conversation, not as scripted of a situation.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, I think you're getting more visual cues, which can influence the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
There can be a lot of information that's communicated in those visual cues that you see in another person when they're talking to you. The problem with these platforms that we do know, if you have multiple people on the show, there's a lot of distraction. So keeping that focus, I've done a lot of live audio conversations with co-hosts and things like that. And you're exactly right. It is easier to concentrate just on that conversation, but you don't have that other input of the video part of it, right? That can add another layer to it. So yeah, there's good and bad with it.
A couple of comments. One, just to highlight what you said earlier, Rob, about expectations. So I think that's a super useful comment. And I think where when you go too deep or whatever you do goes wrong is when people are like thrown off by it, you know. And I think that it's a good thing, number one, in general, but one thing that Chris and I can even take to these, hey, we do that up front to you. Oh, hey, this is just a conversation, by the way, you know, and you know, if you have a problem, you know, answering a question, you could throw it back to us. That's one of the things that we do in our show. If we ask them a question they don't have the answer to, they could ask us. But also, we'll say things like, oh, we've been experimenting with, because we're like good cop, bad cop in our episodes. So, hey, one of us might sort of jump in and be a bad cop in a moment, kind of give you a little bit of a hard time, but you know, you're welcome to come become the bad cop too. Like, so we'll kind of give people that heads up. And I think that what's interesting about that, just coming from my performance background in various settings, music, whatnot, is what's fun is you see things on TV, radio, whatever, that seem unscripted, and they are unscripted, but it doesn't mean that ahead of time somebody didn't say, hey, listen, like this is kind of how it's going to go. And I think that's really useful. Yeah,
because some guests will kind of expect you to give them a bunch of questions and ask for that. They'll say, well, you know, I need to know what you're going to talk about and what questions so I can prepare. And I think at that point is when you need to, you know, if your format isn't a scripted outline following that you're doing, that's when you got to tell them that, well, this is kind of like you coming to Starbucks and meeting me and we talk for an hour, right? If that's your format, that's probably a good way to let them know that this is a casual conversation instead of a serious scripted outlined following you know, a step-by-step question, which I don't think you should really ever do. I think you can create the outline, but my experience is you typically don't follow it very much. Yeah.
The other point I think is interesting to make, you know, based on this, oh, is it audio only? Is there video? One thing that I've noticed in working with some other people who do coaching, we talk about with each other how important it is to be listening and be present, and even to take notes. Sometimes it's really useful to take notes while you're coaching someone so that you really get on point with what they're at. And I think that for a lot of people that is more useful and it brings their focus higher. But I have heard people say they lose focus, right? Because they're not looking at the person and talking to them, right? So we'll just make this point that presence for different people means different things. So one person could be more present by shutting off the video and just doing the audio. Another person could be present by being in the video and taking notes. Another person could be present by not taking notes, you know, and being just in the video. And a follow-up on that is to be aware of what helps you be more present. So for example, on my Saturday events that I'm doing, I'm like planning it, I'm promoting it, I'm trying to manage the conversation, I'm trying to make sure the streaming is going on. And I realized by bringing other people on the team and saying, okay, you're going to take over the stream, you know, you're going to take over taking notes, you're going to take over this. I'm not fully, I haven't fully managed to do that, but I have noticed that the more that I can realize, oh, my job here is to be present. You know, my job here, my best job here is not to manage the episode, even though I know how to do that. How can I outsource that, or how can I automate that in a way so that my presence level can be increased?
Just to add to that, I think one of the ways that I measure if I am engaged in listening is how good are my follow-up questions. The first question is easy because I usually have it written down, but if I'm really listening and engaged, do I ask good follow-up questions? That's one of the ways I measure it.
I was just going to say, I have an outline of the conversation that I share with the guest beforehand, and I have it up on my screen. So I'm usually looking at the podcast guest throughout the entire show. I've had a lot of people comment that it's probably the first or one of the few times that they've actually had a podcast host actually pay attention just by looking at them throughout the entire podcast. So just
And do you use the video Vinay, or is it just
yeah,
to
I absolutely use the video as opposed to I know there's a lot of audiograms that people share about them. I'm trying to go video, so yeah. I'm not quite there yet, but still fleshing out those processes.
And then do you share that on a YouTube channel, or where do you put that content? I'm curious.
Yeah, that's so. We share it on YouTube, but I would also repurpose it. There's a few tools rather that you could use to repurpose the format, so you could share it on social media as well. Yeah.
A little tip of another podcast you're just making me think of. It's kind of unrelated, but I found another podcast recently where what they do is they do full-length interviews, but they only publish I don't know if it's the first 15 minutes or like a certain 15 minutes as the podcast. And then if you want to become some sort of subscriber, then you can access the full interviews. So I'm just thinking of that in terms of asking this question: what's the value of video content? Perhaps your video is something that isn't public, but it's something that's private if people want to review the video content, or maybe you just use it to create little snippets. So there's definitely different ways you can use that to your advantage. So did anybody else have something? I feel like I cut somebody off when I was talking there. I can also move the agenda along to something else if...
The last thing I was going to say, Ethan, too, I had an interest in some of the pre-recording interviews. I've had a few interesting guests that want to talk by screen share. And so then that gave me a whole other idea, which was like, wait a minute, for the right crowd, this is exactly what they want to look at, which is like you're listening on one end, but then you get your visual on the other where you're seeing like a screen getting driven. And that got me thinking that could be a really cool, like a whole other space or a whole other direction. But then it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of it. You got to make sure that the listenership is even interested in that type of thing. Because if your listenership has literally only been in the headphones since your early podcast, can you even make that conversion? Or is it a good way of getting a whole brand new slate of content consumers, right? Maybe it's like a totally different way that you can get people that are going to be more into your content, but they want to look at it instead of listen to it. So I don't know. These are all a lot of awesome ideas right here.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I mean, intuitively, I think it is. So I've been releasing a podcast. I just started it. It's a little bit spotty releasing it as a podcast, but so I have this weekly meeting that I do. 50 to 100 people are joining a Zoom call on Saturdays. And sometimes people are, it's like a tech tool, not a tech tool thing. It's like an analog tool thing. So some people actually like, here's this tool that I use. I'll show it to you on screen share and things like that. And what I found with that particular medium is my philosophy of publishing it as a podcast is, number one, the listeners drive a lot. And so they can just listen to that while they're listening. And number two, I have a member area where they can access the videos. So it's because the podcast in general is almost just a lead magnet for a subscription. Then by listening to something and hearing that there's something to be seen, they can go, oh, I got to go check that out. I missed out on something. Oh, it's great to have the audio. That's cool. Great conversation, but I missed out on something video. Let me go access the archives. Moving on to some other topics, we can hit this again if we want a little bit. I wanted to bring up some of the major points from Cortland's episode last time. And I think we covered a bit about quality and consistency. One thing I'm interested in, and I'm especially interested in maybe hearing Rob's point of view, is this idea of incorporating trends. And I'm specifically interested in you because you do the new media show. And it seems like that when I've seen that show, it's like you're always talking about what's the latest thing going on. And is that intentional? Is that just what you guys like to talk about? Do you find that helps drive listenership? Any comments about that?
Yeah, I think trends kind of give your it kind of runs in two different directions. I think it helps build the podcaster's kind of reputation as a little bit of a thought leader. I think on one side, if you spend a lot of time in a particular subject area or topic area, I think you develop kind of deeper knowledge of that area and what's going on in that area. Especially if you look at what Todd and I do on the show that we do together. We've been around this medium for so long, so we've seen a lot of the history, right? So we can apply history to the present and to the future. And that's kind of what we try and do, is look at, what is the trend line? Where are things evolving? Where is the change elements? Where are the factors that are causing disruption, right? So those are oftentimes trends, right, that are happening in the medium. Is the medium growing? Is whatever you're doing improving? Is it declining? Is there some disruptor that's going on out there? Is there something either unethical or wrong or missing out on an opportunity, right? So those are all related to trends, right? So I think if you can bring in that kind of thought leadership into any podcast and try and extract that out of your guests too, right? So you kind of create this, you have your own expertise driving the thought leadership, but then that guest that you bring on, maybe that thought leader contributes to that thought leadership, and then you learn as a host, but your audience learns as well. So that's the part of it that I've been doing for many years. I did a nationally syndicated radio show for 6 years on the growth and development of the internet, and that was all about trends, right? The growth of wireless, the growth of internet connectivity, the growth of software, mobile apps, all that stuff, and following those trends and where things were moving next. And I think it's a powerful content area, pretty much for a lot of formats of podcasting, but not all.
I'm assuming that just because of your natural interest that, you can bring a lot to the table in a conversation on the New Media Show, just because you've been reading some blogs and, meeting some people and talking about some things at Libsyn, whatever.
Yeah.
But do you also do any sort of intentional research to say, or even an agenda? Oh, this episode, we want to hit on this because that's, people are going to talk about that, or we want to talk about it. Do you have research and planning?
Yeah, well, there's kind of two ends of the spectrum. So I also do, a fair amount of writing too. So I put these trends, like the top 10 trends from 2020 with podcasting, or, future looking 2021 trends, right? Things are moving forward, but oftentimes these trend discussions are just integrated into the conversation because that's the format of the show, right? And I have a long history of doing those types of shows, so it flows just naturally out of me. But if I think back to my earlier days with my radio show, I did a huge amount of research in all sorts of areas, whether it be internet security, whether it be e-commerce, wireless technology, and stuff like that, to develop that expertise. And then each guest I would bring on would add to that expertise. So and then you're more able to project, well, this is where we are now, and this is where the trends are moving. Right.
Thanks for sharing. Did someone else have something to say about that? Henry, I know that you've, of course, talked about, small business loans during quarantine and things like that. Those are trending things, but how much are you aware of what's trending for small businesses when you do your episodes?
It is one of the things that I took away from the conversation last week, and I just added it to my outline. I added two things. First, incorporating trends in the conversation, and kind of Rob just kind of triggered how I think I'll do it. Instead of saying at the beginning of the show, here's the latest trend I've seen, unless it's appropriate, I might add it into a question, make it part of a question. So, I've just observed this trend. How has that been impacting you? So I might incorporate it that way. So I'm giving that more thought. But the question, I know I'm not answering directly your question. He made a big point about revenues and about making sure people shared their revenue numbers. That's not something I usually ask, probably because I guess I'm probably shy about asking. And so that's another thing that I'm going to start incorporating where appropriate with my interviews. But trends, sometimes I do it, like you said, if it's a topic episode where it lends itself to it, I got to do more of it so that I continue to bring that to be part of the content.
Yeah,
it's
it's
also
interesting
adding value to the listener that they
Mhm.
can maybe apply to their own life and
That's
then
right.
make different choices that can maybe align them with opportunities.
I'll give you an example of how I did it recently, and I hadn't really thought about it. I've interviewed a guy a couple times about his business is a pallet brokering business, wooden pallets, getting them from point A to point B. He's made a business out of that. And so I did get a little bit of research on how many pallets are there in the United States. So it turns out there are almost 2 billion pallets in the United States. That maybe is not a trend, but as an example of going and researching a data point, a statistic, a trend, and then sharing that with the audience as part of asking a question or leading to a question. Yeah.
pseudo related to what you're talking about here. You're talking about, and not that you have to be one of those people that always asks revenue numbers and things like that. I think that's, maybe reserved for certain shows, but it's interesting how it aligns with what we were talking about earlier about kind of being a little bit risky, like,
Yeah.
so I know I've heard from Cortland said he found that sharing the revenue numbers help. And then also we had Mixergy podcast on, they do revenue numbers on that show. I know with Mixergy, for example, there's sort of like a reputation where people kind of know when they go on, they're probably going to have to. And then, so I think the point I'm trying to make is that it could be combined doing that with this idea up front, right? Where you prepare people. Hey, just, I don't know if you noticed, but on this show, we share revenue numbers. You could either say, I usually push people a little bit. If you're uncomfortable, fine. You don't have to. Or, you could make a hard line. Like whenever I ask, this is what I expect of my guests. If you don't want to share them, I'll find another guest. People take different approaches.
And remember that, you may not know, like with Vinay, I send an outline ahead of time. So I just need to start adding that question. I think the way I'll approach it, if they're not quite comfortable giving me exact, then give me a range. Are we talking in the 500 to $1 million range, above $1 million, is if they're more comfortable sharing that. I have to learn how to do that because I haven't really done that, but I get it. If I was a listener and I'm listening to Ethan tell me the story of this great business, context, I think I better put it in context if you tell me what we're talking about. Is this a $50,000 a year business, or is this approaching $1 million a year business? So
that can be really important for the listener.
He has that. Yeah. Now in his niche, I can definitely get it, where those people that, that startup mentality, that indie hacker mentality, I get where he uncovered that was something they wanted to hear. And as when he was articulating what was the big thing about why his show is successful, he said treat it like a business and the research that he did. And that's when he went off on that, talking about how he researched and found that to be one of the things that people want.
Right. His specific audience. Yeah. I was going to make a comment based on what I know of Adrian too. I know, he worked in a high growth startup that's, headed to go public probably. And so that has its own context. Mm-hmm. And then some people run their own small business. I know you're interviewing people from large businesses, different size corporations. And I think that's, like you said, context, it's important. If somebody's telling me how to, even to build a business, right? The topic that we talk about, it's different to build a small, solopreneur business than it is to build Apple,
Absolutely.
It's just different.
Yeah, and I think those sensitivities are different. Like, I had a guy a couple weeks ago who's got an awesome small business where he's probably doing a couple $1 million a year in coffee. And talking to this guy compared to talking to an individual who's in charge of a 200-person CX team, where that P&L alone is huge. It's massive. And then on top of it, when you enter in the whole VC space, there's a whole set of regs and rules around what they can even talk about anyway. So like for me, I'd have to absolutely have that conversation before I do. It's funny though. You guys have just challenged me for what I'm going to do on the next phone call. I'm going to start asking people, hey, would you talk about rev and would you talk about sales? Because hearing this conversation is making me think, if this is like a whole customer show, you should be really like wide open around, we're so good at dealing with our customers that we're doing X in revenue and we're doing Y in growth. And this is our retention rate. So you've given me some ideas. I'm gonna have to start seeing if people will take this. It would make it for more interesting, valuable content. It really would.
I think so. One of the ways I've asked around it and thinking about it is I usually will ask how soon before you got profitable, how soon before you were able to replace your income that you were making in your job, because I interview a lot of people that transition from the corporate world. I don't necessarily ask them to give me those specific numbers, but I ask it in that roundabout way. But I think now it's about being more specific and asking when it's appropriate.
It's probably good to ask that before the interview too.
Yeah.
So they can prepare for it.
Yeah.
So you don't put them on the spot and then they don't have the numbers. Right.
Agreed. That's not probably something you want to put them on the spot with.
Yeah. I think that sounds like a very useful way to approach it. Like, have them be aware, make sure they're aware before you do any of that stuff. Just a little extra note on this idea of being willing to create a little bit of edginess in the episodes. I'm thinking of a book I recently read called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. It's a highly recommended book about, management teams and how to get them working together. And I forget exactly the actual 5 dysfunctions, but it's a narrative book where she talks through a scenario with an actual team and, tells the story. And one of the dysfunctions of the team is that they're not willing to push their boundaries and speak honestly with each other. Basically, they don't have that honesty level. And she gave the analogy or sort of the example of why is it okay to risk offending someone, for example. Again, we want to prepare people. We don't want to surprise people. We don't want to make it some sort of weird, game, your tricks you're playing on people. But why is it okay to risk those moments? And she said, people talk all the time about how they don't like meetings, and she says, it's often because they're boring. What's the problem with making a meeting a little bit interesting with some conflict, bringing up something that people should be talking about, but nobody's talking about, it's probably actually the thing that nobody's talking about that they should talk about that needs to be talked about at the meeting. Right. That's why everybody doesn't want to be there, because it's never going to get talked about. So it's an interesting argument for being willing to kind of bring those things in a little bit.
Hey, I thought I'd jump in if I could, Ethan. Of course. At the time, one of the things that struck me from Cortland's sharing his information is, and we talked about it on the call last week, is how much time he spends getting ready for an episode. An extraordinary amount of time, more time than I can possibly dedicate. I'm just curious as to everybody's thoughts on that.
I'll say that more recently, Chris and I have been really thinking about how can we make it a better quality podcast, especially since we're part of that network with Cortland now. And that's one of the things that he's recommending, and that's not just, of course we want it to be quality, but we might be thinking about promotion, we might be thinking about other things. So we're focusing on that now. So I've been trying to do some more background research on people and prep. And I think that it does come back to the thing kind of mentioned earlier in a different context of this focus and intention. And I'm finding that by putting extra focus and intention to something that I may not have wanted to previous, or may not have felt like I had the time for, I'm reaping the rewards of it. Like, it takes me having the faith in doing it, that it's useful. So recently we had a guest on the show, and, just took the time to review his LinkedIn profile, took the time to read to watch a few other interviews that he had done with other people, took the time to find something obscure. Chris and I talked about, he watches the Hot Wings show. And I think we mentioned this sometimes before, how it's just kind of like they bring in funny things about people. So I took some time to find maybe some obscure things about the person that might be interesting to bring into the conversation. I'll tell you what, they live in Chicago, and I wouldn't have known that if I didn't do the research ahead of that.
Well, and that's
so
fair.
We could talk about that.
I spent about an hour researching, but I added up as he was describing, he's spending 3-4 hours. He's blocking out 3 days a week, if I understood him correctly, for podcasting. That's obviously reflects in why his show is so popular. I wouldn't be able to even do that because of everything else I have. So the stuff that you're talking about makes sense. I do a lot of that, but I think even an hour per episode, sometimes I'm like, is this time worthwhile?
So this is the way that I'm approaching it now, and I approached it with other things. So for the podcast previously, Chris and I, one of our strategies for getting guests was listening to other podcasts and then, contacting the guest, because that's a good example of someone who might go on a podcast, right?
Right.
So the actual listening to the podcast, I didn't feel like I had the time. Then I started going for bike rides and listening to the podcast, and that
Sure.
seemed like actually a good synergy. Point being, another thing that Cortland brought up that I thought was interesting is he tries, instead of like fitting something in as an extra thing, to see how it integrates with the other things, So I don't know exactly what your schedule is like, but an example could be, if you already have to research something for your co-working space, for example, for that business project that you're doing, well, maybe then that allows you to both, have a guest that talks about co-working spaces, do the research. So like, in the end, you might be doing 3 or 4 hours of research, but it's not actually much more research than you already would have done in a week, because you were doing it for multiple projects and it gets combined. I kind of have a feeling that's part of what's going on with Cortland, because he's not just researching for just the podcast. He's got a website related to it. He's got other things going on.
Yeah, there's a
sometimes
lot
he's
of
just
content
curious.
that comes from that research, right? Not just a podcast episode also.
Exactly. I mean, that's my intuition about how he kind of pulls it off, and he seems to have a good amount of free time too. So, yeah. So we got a couple more minutes here, just to give a preview for next week's guest is going to be Jay Klaus, and he started a really, really cool podcast project not too long ago, but it's grown pretty fast, and I'd like to talk to him. He actually planned it out quite a bit beforehand. He spent 9 months before, like, getting his interviews nailed down and getting things together. But his first guests were, his first guest was Seth Godin, and his second guest was James Clear. So he's able to get some good guests. But he also, one of the things he credits for his sort of success is he joined a podcast network. And it was something he decided intentionally that he thought would be a good idea. And I thought I'd just bring that to the table for a second, especially maybe Rob, because you probably see all kinds of trends with that. What are you seeing with podcast networks? And should people join a podcast network? Would that really help? Should they start a podcast network? Any thoughts on that?
Well, the network side of podcasting has been growing for many years. It's getting more and more popular, I believe, as it's becoming more competitive out there, between shows feeling like they're, independent, flying in the wind out there and don't have a lot of support. I think a lot of people think of joining a network as it to some degree is somewhat of a marketing strategy, and then also hopefully a monetization strategy. So you kind of see it kind of two parts to it. Primarily is what most people think of it. There's there's a lot of ways to get involved in a network. There's networks that have a variety of different genres in them, and then there's networks that are very focused on a specific genre. So it's the concept of a street corner that has a McDonald's and a Burger King and a Wendy's in there, right? You can be different genres, but you're aggregating based on a network strategy, right? Where there can be cross promotion, there can be a lot of benefits in that. If you're joining a network that has a bunch of shows that are exactly the same, or just slight variables on there, and I've seen podcast networks in both areas, there can be plus or minus benefits on that. People can share audience across those networks, and it can be helpful. I think you have to be careful. If you're an independent producer, signing your show over to a network can come with some downsides too. There can be a lot of expectations that are set that you basically invest a lot in your show because you're expecting this network to do something for you to grow your audience or to monetize your show, and there's a possibility it doesn't happen. So I think you have to go into it with your eyes open and read the fine print of any contract, just to make sure that you don't agree to something or lock yourself in, basically giving control or rights to your show over to a network. Can cause problems getting out of those deals too. So I see a lot of shows leaving networks, joining networks, choosing just to stay independent. And then I see other shows that start up that are successful and they build their own network. So it's all over the map. But the comments that I see generally in the industry right now is what we're going to see fall out of what we're seeing in the market right now is there's going to be networks of networks. So that's the next big thing that's coming, is that all of these smaller networks are all going to aggregate around a bigger network, and to some degree, you're seeing that happen a little bit with Spotify and some of these platforms acquiring networks, right? So you're seeing a listening platform acquire a network, and then the next thing is going to be listening platforms that are going to be set up like a network, right? So you're going to have genre-based listening platforms that are going to be set up like a common area theme or genre content offering too. So networks are here with us to stay. They're only going to get more powerful because those networks can form alliances with the big listening platforms to get more promotion. So that is a possibility, and that's a follow. I mean, just to let you all know, I used to be the chief content officer for Podcast One. So those were the big principles that I worked under, working with Apple and being part of a network. You do have a little bit more clout with the listening platforms to get feature and promotion and cross promotion.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like signing to a record label if you're a musician, or signing to a publishing company if you're a writer. Yeah, you gotta know what you're getting into.
And the things that have popped up here recently is that popular shows sign with a network and they become even more popular, and people want to renege on their contracts and renegotiate, and that creates a legal storm. So let's say you had, going into a contract with a network, you had 10,000 listeners to an episode, but 2 months into the contract, 3 months into the contract, you're now getting 1 million listeners. But the network did a deal with you to pay you, a very small amount of money for your show, and they're getting, a huge amount of revenue. So just make sure that you have clauses in your contract that escalate with revenue that's associated with your show.
Yeah, very interesting. It'll be interesting to ask him his thought process, because I think he also, within that 9 months, it seems like he put time into making sure he put that together well and finding the right podcast network. And it sounds like he went looking for them as opposed to them looking for him, maybe, of course, because he hadn't even started a podcast yet. So maybe that's an advantage. You can kind of really set things up so you find one that's reputable and it's not just something that falls in your lap and things like that. Cool. Well, we got about a minute left. Happy if anyone has any other comments or questions to wrap up with, or we can just call it a call. Anybody got anything else they want to add at the end here?
I'd like to just ask you a question about future guests, dates and things of that nature. I sent you an email, but I know.
Oh yeah, we can stay on for a minute.
Yeah,
okay. Yeah, we can stay on for a minute after. Cool. Yeah, sounds good. Okay, so then without further ado, I'll sign us off. I'll send out a copy of this document that I shared today to Adrian, other people that were signed up, and I'll send out a link where you can join for next week as well. And we'll see you around. Thanks for showing up. We appreciate y'all being here.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Later. Bye-bye.
Bye.